Jeff Lee, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you today. You're joining us from the DC area. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about creating diverse and inclusive cultures in politics and business. And as we were chatting in the pre-interview, we were kind of joking about how we're just lumping all the fun, kind of messy topics all together in this conversation today. And, I felt like throwing politics in there too is important, just because it's a huge part of the social landscape, and really what organizations are wrestling with as they're trying to create inclusive environments. While largely we're going to be focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion within a workplace setting, I think a little bit of a dialogue around what the current landscape is in politics and how we can foster better, more inclusivity in the political arena and within our communities. I think that'll be part of the conversation. As we get started, I wanted to share Jeff's bio with everybody. Jeff Lee has had a career at the highest levels of public policy and politics at the state, federal, and international levels. A recognized thought leader in political advocacy and representation, his analysis and opinions have been featured on MSNBC and in Politico magazine, the New York Times, USA Today, the Washington Post, Fox News, The Hill, Washingtonian, Roll Call, Bustle, Forbes, and many other local and regional newspapers and broadcast television in 30 states. During the height of the Stop Asian Hate movement, Jeff penned an opinion piece that received national attention in Politico magazine called "I Thought I Knew How to Succeed as an Asian in U.S. Politics. Boy, was I wrong." That highlighted his experience in workplace discrimination in politics and racism throughout his life. And it's such a pleasure to have you. It's a hard thing to talk about these issues and this topic, and clearly you've had challenging experiences in your life. I appreciate you being vulnerable and taking the time to meet with me and share your thoughts and insights with me and my listeners. Anything else you would like to share by way of your background before we dive on in?
I think first off, thanks so much for the very, very kind introduction. I think the big thing to note is I'm the son of immigrants, just like many, many Americans in this country. My parents were boat people from Vietnam that escaped the communist regime after the fall of Saigon. We're refugees in Thailand and the Philippines over the course of 6 years. Landed in California. I was born a year after, and they started, like many immigrants, a small business. They started a gardening company. At 8 years old, John, my first job was mowing lawns with my dad. And I learned 3 things about mowing lawns with my dad. Number one, the summers, even in a place like California that doesn't have humidity, is very hot. 2, people tend to treat you based on what they think your value is. So if they perceive you having a certain value, they'll treat you that way. And 3, the value of education is one of the most important aspects of escaping manual labor, if that's not what you want to do. I think the American dream is so much the case of not just opportunities for your family, but opportunities for the next generation. And so, I have the opportunity to speak with you about these issues, and having worked in public service and in the private sector, being the son of gardeners and chicken farmers, that only really happens in America. So, my critique of our social relations in this country is one of the belief that this is still the greatest country on earth. There's just a lot of things that are not perfect. That's part of the experiment that we have. And I think the more we recognize that there's a lot of room for growth, the better we can be. And that's not just in the way we treat each other, socially, but also in our politics, and also in the business sector as well, which, I look forward to diving into, especially in the areas of representation and equity and inclusion as a whole.
Yeah, excellent. And maybe, if you don't mind, I don't want to dwell too much on it, unless you want to, but that article that you wrote in Politico, mm-hmm. A vulnerable article, and maybe just give us a brief kind of overview of some of what you laid out there. I'm sure in addition to what you just shared about being the son of immigrants, clearly challenges there. But what motivated you to write that article, and what were some of the key points that you laid out?
Sure. Let me talk to you about the 3 reasons why I decided to pour my heart out into national media, which, prior to that piece and prior to writing in the last months before that, I'd never written anything for public consumption. And when you work in politics, it's your goal to avoid the media and press at all costs. So to go into the foray was a little bit of a vulnerable, but also stressful time, and went against all my instincts. But there were 3 important milestones over the course of COVID-19 that really pushed me to write this. The first was my own personal experience. I was traveling in March of 2020, just before the world was afflicted with COVID-19. And I was in an airport rushing to get to the gate, and a woman went up to me and spit in my face and told me to go back where I came from. I don't think she meant California or Georgia or DC. I think she meant China, which, by the way, being Vietnamese, I mean, it's a bit of an interesting thing to be told to go back to China. That was really hard. Not the being spit on part, unfortunately, has happened to me over the course of my life. And as an Asian American, we're always taught to diffuse these situations and to blend back in as quickly as possible. So I usually have a litany of jokes off the top of my head to diffuse the tension. And when she spit on me, the thing I said was, gosh, if I'd known it was going to rain, I should have brought an umbrella. That was my first reaction. And that part is very humbling, but the part that's quite shameful is there were about a dozen people who saw what happened and they just turned away. So I didn't matter. It didn't matter. People wanted to go about their day. It's pretty brutal.
It's terrible. Terrible.
And I'd like to think, John, that like if you were there, you would be, having a fit. But it's a really complicated thing when you see these things, you don't know what to do, which is why we should talk about sort of aspects that individuals can do for others as a good ally. So that experience really painted what COVID-19 looks like at a time where Asian Americans in the last year, according to the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at Cal State San Bernardino, we've had hate crimes up, in the community 339%. Black Jewish Americans facing also higher levels. The FBI announced that hate crimes at a 12-year high. And even in a place like California, which has 16% of the country's Asian Americans, they've seen reported hate crimes, I should say, among the community up over 107%. And by the way, 2/3 of those are generally women. And this is all underreporting, most likely. So these are astronomical numbers if you think about groups and communities that some of which have been here, by the way, since the 19th century. Right. So there are, despite the fact that we have Chinese and Japanese Americans have been here since the mid 1800s, probably longer than most Irish Americans or German Americans or Polish Americans, they're still seen as the other. And during this time, it's so easy to scapegoat. So I was a part of the beginning of that scapegoating. The second thing that happened was that my parents, after they ran this gardening company, ran a free-range organic chicken farm in southern Georgia. It's a very salt of the earth, very rural part of the state. I mean, there's maybe one doctor in the county. It's a really just a very disconnected part of the state. And you might recall at the beginning of the pandemic, there were 3 places afflicted with COVID-19 and deaths. One was in Italy, one was in New York City, and the third one was in southern Georgia, where quite a few people got sick going to a funeral. And that was about 15 minutes from my parents' house. And in the aftermath of that, my parents noticed the neighbors weren't talking to them as much. Eventually they asked, this was sometime in August. And they said, we really like you. You've been here 20 years, but you're the reason why the virus is here. And that was just so crushing. My parents are actually some of the biggest Americans I could think of. I mean, right now that the Olympics on, they're all wearing their USA stuff, rooting for figure skating and this sort of thing, because it's something they identify with so closely. And despite breaking bread with folks, doing business with folks, celebrating birthdays with their neighbors' children, they're still actually not considered American. That's really hard. And the third thing that really, I think, just jumped me into saying, okay, enough's enough. In March of last year, you might recall there were a number of Asian women that were hunted down at these spas by an assailant. My sister lives 15 minutes away from one of those spas. And I think the confluence of all that, plus hundreds of people reaching out, checking in on us, made me realize that we have an obligation to say something. Because if you don't say something, nothing happens. And on top of that, you can be the most brilliant person, John, but you can't read my mind. I can't read your mind. We have to have that dialogue and discourse. And again, Asians are taught to put your head down, work hard, play by the rules, and eventually you get some sort of recognition or some sort of credit. But there's sort of an implicit turning of the cheek that that's the cost of doing business, is that you kind of have to lose yourself in that. And so for me, getting to the piece of it, so now that you have the background, it's really three big tenets. The first tenet is that Asian Americans need to learn from other communities of color to make a stand and stand for what they believe in, working with others to effectuate change, which means going against all the programming that they've been taught to blend in. That's one. Two, if Asian Americans want to be a part of the political process, they also need to be, ruthless in how they advocate for their issues. And that's an opportunity that goes against a lot of the programming as well. And the third piece is the pipeline of developing good talent in good communities, being able to encourage leaders to enter these areas so there can be more representation and opportunity. I'll tell you, when I worked in the United States Congress, there were only 4 House chiefs of staff in the entire building. Think about it. The chief policy advisor to members of Congress, there was only 4. Today, that number is more like 5. That was 15 years ago. The numbers are the same, right? So I think there's a lot of challenges here. And I mean, I can tell you in the broader society, Asian Americans as a group, tend to do well economically. But if you actually disperse the numbers, the facts, the data, if you can parse out the difference between Japanese Americans and Vietnamese Americans, you'll find that there are more groups in that space that have lower rates of high school graduation, higher rates of experiences in the criminal justice system, lower access to health care, and a higher mortality rate than other groups that you probably picture. So there is a need to just have more specificity in how we approach communities, understanding that it's not a monolith, just like how the Latino Hispanic community is not a monolith, right? Being able to parse that out accordingly. And frankly, Asian Americans in politics don't owe any group anything. In the last 2020 cycle, more than half of them weren't even contacted by either party. You would think that's kind of a big deal when you think this group is the swing group in most of the battleground states, whether that's Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Nevada, Arizona. You would think that races that are decided by less than 4 points probably matter when you have groups that are moving exponentially in speed and are becoming more interested in politics and more frustrated that they're not being included in the process. That's part of the gist of what I was trying to focus on.
Yeah. I mean, so much there. And again, all I can say is it's heartbreaking, and I can apologize on behalf of, the country, and it's just horrible. It should never happen. Nobody should have to experience those sorts of things. And what you described in the airport, for example, my first thought is a bystander effect, right? So many people observe something like that. And like you said, they either think someone else will step in, or they're like, this is incredibly uncomfortable. I'm not sure what to do. So I'm just going to ignore it, pretend like I didn't just see this happen. And those types of effects are powerful. And so we need to proactively be allies. We need to be willing to step in, even if it means we're going to be a little bit uncomfortable, because, I'm a straight cisgender white dude, and I have lots of privilege associated with those characteristics, which means if I have privilege, I have a voice, and I can speak up in defense of people that may seem, that may be more voiceless in particular settings or situations. And if I don't use that, if I don't use that privilege in those opportunities, then I don't know, like I'm definitely part of the problem. So I think we definitely need to be thinking more about that in the public space, in our communities. The same thing happens all the time in organizations, though, too. I truly believe most people in most organizations want to be inclusive. They want to be kind and courteous, and they want people around them to feel valued. And it is generally, in my experience, kind of the clear minority of people who end up being jerks about it and say things even either on purpose or even just kind of they're unintentionally, perhaps willfully, ignorantly, saying dumb, stupid, hurtful things. But they still get a voice, and they still get they suck air out of the room. And a lot of times it's because everyone else in the room, everyone who thinks this is horrible, I can't believe they just said that, I can't believe they just did that, instead of like standing up to them and calling it out and saying we need to do something about this, they just sit passively by, and they might passive aggressively after the meeting say, oh, I can't believe he said that or whatever. But that doesn't actually do anything unless we address it. And so we do need to think about allyship. We need to think about advocacy on behalf of populations that need assistance in those types of situations. And in this case, we're talking about Asian Americans, but it could be any group. It could be any individual that is being treated unfairly and not treated with dignity and respect. And I couldn't help, I was chuckling in my mind a little bit. It's like one of those like crying emoji, laughing emoji, crying emoji at the same time, right? Because how often do we hear about Asian Pacific Islander as a group, right? And so, I mean, that is crazy, because clearly you have so many different Asian populations, you have so many different Pacific Islander populations, and then we lump them all into just one group and say, here is the Asian Pacific Islander population. And that just isn't the level of specificity we need. Longtime listeners of the podcast probably know and remember, I've lived extensively in Asia. I lived for about 3 years in South Korea. I've lived and visited China many times, Indonesia and Japan, and various places. And yeah, I mean, there's some commonalities across cultures, but they're all unique, and they're unique people, unique individuals, and we just need to do a little bit better in being thoughtful. Just like I wouldn't want anyone to make just blanket assumptions about me because I'm a white dude. Other groups don't want blanket assumptions made about them either, for whatever their characteristics happen to be.
I think you highlighted two points to put a fine tip on. One is that silence is complicity, right? Because if you don't say something, it's sort of blessed. Whether you might disagree with it, you sort of make that assumption that it's too much of a hassle to make a stand for it. And the second is great power comes great responsibility, right? The Spider-Man sort of quote about this, because you're right. I mean, it isn't just about privilege, it's about power at the end of the day. And you'd be surprised in individual settings how much power others have. I'll give you an example. I mean, just last month, I had a mentally disturbed person go up to me and ask me to, show me where the Great Wall of China was, and to see if I could help him get to fortune. Right. And this is happening. And he's saying it kind of in an aggressive way as I'm trying to diffuse it. Because again, I have a joke for every situation. And there are people in their athleisure with their designer dogs having brunch, seeing this and not saying anything. And that's a really difficult place to be, and it identifies that otherness. It defines loneliness sometimes, and frankly, this sort of reminder that you're not actually a part of it. You just rent it. You're just rented. You're not bought in. And I think that's really hard for Asian Americans in particular, who, for all intents and purposes, aren't really the focus or aren't considered to be a part of the social justice fabric in the same way that maybe other groups get top billing on. And obviously it's hard to, sort of compare and contrast. That's not the goal here, but just to say that this group in particular, which by the way, yes, 50 ethnicities, 100 languages at least, probably has experienced some challenge. And I think that's the thing to highlight, that we're not white. And that's something that's just worth noting, especially to listeners here, but also to businesses and companies who sometimes put us in the position of, oh, you're not really a minority, or like, oh, you're a great worker. We'll give you your 2% raise. But we're never going to consider you for the executive suite or the C-suite, right? That is a pretty common thing. Or you're not making partner at the law firm, right? That's a pretty common thing. You'll have large percentages of folks sort of toiling in the mid-level, and there is a bamboo ceiling. And it's partly because as the higher up you go, the more externally you represent organizations. And maybe there's a sort of perception that you're not American enough for some of these groups.
Yeah, yeah. Um, as we transition now in the remaining minutes, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what we can do in terms of allyship and advocacy within our organizational settings. We find ourselves in meetings, we have interactions with colleagues or with suppliers, with customers, whomever, right? And there's lots of interactions, lots of opportunities for just little simple things to happen that can the microaggressions that can negatively impact people over time. So clearly, any overt racism is completely unacceptable. It needs to be called out immediately. But we don't see, well, maybe I'm wrong, but that may not be as common as just the little microaggressions that there's just a steady stream of. So tell us your perspective on that, and maybe what we can do to interrupt those types of experiences for minority and underrepresented populations, and what we can do to support them better.
Sure. I mean, there's a few things that individuals and organizations can do. So I've got a couple off the top of my head. The first is learn Asian American history, broadly speaking. Read Asian American authors. The thing I recommend every organization I speak with, PBS has a great documentary on the history of Asian Americans in the country. Very good, very extensive. I promise you that every Asian American that watches it will learn something as well. It's such an extensive focus. There are some incredible authors in the space that sort of highlight some of the challenges that the communities had. Viet Thanh Nguyen, Kathy Park Hong, Charles Yu. We can put those in the show notes, but there's just incredible authors that can kind of highlight the unique parallels of history, but also trauma in coming here. Right. I mean, my parents were boat people. They left everything, including the country they know, to come to a place where they know nothing. You can imagine how hard it was to access the DMV, let alone figure out your role in society. Okay, so I think those things matter. The second thing, which is again, atypical, but if you have Asian American friends, Pacific Islander friends, ask them to share their family story. Very few folks actually ask. It's one of those things that for some reason not talked about, but I think having a personal touch does go a long way. And again, I would say most Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders would, I think, be so surprised you'd want to know versus maybe other groups that would be exhausted that you're asking them. In the business sector, I always tell folks, to look into cultural training that's very specific for managers, try to understand different cultures, anti-racism trainings, which are important. The point you raised, John, about bystander training. I mean, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the organization Hollaback have great trainings. We'll put in the show notes, 1 hour of your time to diffuse a situation and be an active, not just ally, but, defender, I would say, in this space. What organizations can do? I mean, 360 assessments go a long way. Transparency. I think there's definitely some stereotyping that happens. Candid conversations with hiring managers about goals and promotions. I hear all the time of Asian Americans who meet their goals but never get promoted. So what does it actually take? Just have that. Mentorship, sponsorship. I mean, you, John, everyone listening here, doesn't matter what their creed is, but having the opportunity to mentor, support, be a champion for a young person goes a long way for pipeline. Right, especially if they're non-traditional, absolutely. For what you could do with your dollars, I mean, during the pandemic, you might recall, PPP loans were given out to small businesses. So Asian-owned small businesses, so restaurants, laundromats, this sort of thing, got money. But of course, what happened was these businesses had higher percentages of vandalism. So actually, a lot of the loans went to fix the place up because of broken windows. So, if you can support small business, small restaurants where you can, right? The Asian American Foundation, an organization that was started during this time. I mean, they are playing a role as sort of a lead donor convener within the space. Check them out. Stop AAPI Hate, nonprofit focused on reportings of acts of violence, acts of discrimination, acts of hate. They probably deserve attention. Check out their latest reports. They have one, I think, coming out later in February that would be worth discussing. Last three things on the policy front. I mean, you've probably seen a lot on these, DEI B councils, right? It's great. Pay them, pay people who are actually on these councils. LinkedIn does it. I think most companies should do this too. You should also have company bonuses based on DEI metrics for the leadership. If they don't meet those, they don't get their bonus. I promise you, if you do that, you'll probably get more incentives for people to align. Last piece, because women have been disproportionately affected during the pandemic, especially with the latest waves here, childcare, daycare, senior care. The vast majority of that care falls onto the woman for reasons, for historical reasons, for other reasons. Provide that support, pay it out, give the flexibility. There's obviously national discussion on childcare now and on tax credits. That's probably something that really should be pushed. So I think those are a few things that, listeners here thinking about, their leadership role in organizations, nonprofits, the business sector, there's community activists and leaders. These are just a couple examples I would give where there's so much you can do to be, an active, engaged member of citizenry, but also to be a champion and defender for this community.
I love it, Jeff. Well said. Those are great practical things that we can start doing right now. And I encourage everyone to do so. It has been a pleasure being with you. Before we close, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about your work, and then give us a final word for today.
Sure. I mean, you can find me on Twitter at Jeffrey D. Lee, which we'll hopefully get in the show notes there. I have some upcoming writings coming out as well as some TV appearances, which I try to put out where I can. But, the last thing I just leave you with your audience is, it's the little things that matter. It's the timing. It's about showing up. That's everything. I'm not expecting folks to, drop everything and commit their lives to X, Y, but it's about just doing the little things that we talked about. I mean, think of it like you want to get in better health, right? I'm not expecting you to run marathons every day instantly. It's about putting in the steps and the work over time. That's the way to be resilient and be more thoughtful over time. So thank you to everyone listening here. And thank you for your interest in this topic and how we can make the world a better place.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. I encourage listeners to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Jeff can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.